Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Fredla's Learning Community for Family Leaders. Please use the chat box to introduce yourself and tell us where you're from. This learning community is being brought to you by the family-run Executive Director Leadership Association, otherwise known as Fredla. My name is Jane Walker, and I'm the Executive Director of Fredla. We are a proud partner in the National Technical Assistance Network for Children's Behavioral Health, operated by and coordinated through the University of Maryland under a contract with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. I'm obligated to tell you that the views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Human Services. Before we begin, I want to let you know that at the conclusion of our webinar today, there is a short online survey. So when we hit the ending, if you would stay on for just a few seconds longer, very short, very brief survey that just lets us know if this webinar was helpful to you. So, okay, let's roll. It looks like we have lots of new people on our call today, and we welcome you and thank you for joining us. So for those not familiar with Fredla or with our learning community calls, Fredla is a network of family-run organizations. There are about 120 of us across the country, and they were all started by families caring for a child or young adult with mental health or behavioral needs. Fredla's mission is to build leadership and organizational capacity of family-run organizations while promoting their value and influencing policy for our children and families. As I mentioned, Fredla is a partner with the National TA Center. We were started in 2013 by 16 statewide family organizations. So with me today on the call is Millie Sweeney, Deputy Director of Fredla, and Melissa Pearson, Project Director for Fredla. I'm sure both of these names are very familiar to you, as Millie and Melissa have been with Fredla for several years and both work with many organizations across the country just like yours. So the title of our learning community call today is The Power of Telling Your Story. And on our call, we'll be discussing guiding families to effectively tell their story while respecting their child's story as well. Do's and don'ts of social media, involving youth and storytelling, developing a story bank for your organization, and we'll be providing lots of tools and resources at the end of our call. There are many aspects to storytelling, and when you couple that with the emotions of parents talking about their own children, you have the potential for a moving and powerful story. Or the opposite, you could have the potential for disaster. And that's what we're going to try and avoid. So Pixar is a master of storytelling with movies like Toy Story, Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and Up. Pixar director Peter Docter captures the art of storytelling this way. What you're trying to do when you tell a story is to write about an event in your life that made you feel in some particular way. And what you're trying to do when you tell a story is to get the audience to have that same feeling. And isn't that what we try to do as well when we tell our personal stories about our very own families? So these charming figures are storytellers. They're from the Pueblo people of New Mexico. There are many, many figures like this with a mother or father sitting down and children climbing all over them. You notice all the mouths are open wide as they are telling a story to their children. In tribes with no written language, cultural traditions and values historically have been passed on by tribal elders through songs and stories geared to teaching. It is a high honor to be a storyteller in the Pueblo tradition. They are the guardians of the stories of their ancestors. These figures commemorate this tradition. If there is anyone on the call from New Mexico or Pueblo Nation or Niqua and would like to, in the chat box, add anything about these storytellers, we would welcome your input. So storytelling is something passed down through generations. And so too, storytelling is a part of the history and core of the family movement for children's mental health. It was courageous mothers and fathers who stepped forward in the 80s to talk about the challenges they faced getting services for their children. Their stories were used to give families a voice as partners in the system, to raise awareness of mental health needs and effective treatment options, to educate policymakers on services and policies needed to improve systems of care. And finally, on a very personal level, families told their stories to turn their personal pain into power, the power to speak for themselves and the power to influence systems. Our stories can impact how people view us and others in similar circumstances. Our stories are unique and very personal. And the pioneer in the family movement were courageous in telling their stories, and it wasn't easy, and at times they felt very judged when they told their stories. Maybe for some of us that's even true today. So let's hear about your experiences telling stories. We're going to do a quick poll and ask people on the call, how many of you have told your story about your family and your child with mental health needs? Can you just type in your answer there under the question? How many of you publicly told your story? Seen quite a few. I have. Some have done it a few times, others have done it more often. So just as we said, families telling their stories is really a core of the family movement. So now let's ask those of you who have told your stories how you felt when you did tell your story. Did you feel empowered? Did you feel heard? Did you feel it made a difference? Or were you embarrassed and vowed never to do it again? (50-50), empowered and heard, made a difference. So only one person felt embarrassed and vowed never to do it again. I have to tell you my worst story, my nightmare. It happened many years ago when I was invited to meet with the staff of a residential program. The staff were required to come at the end of the day, and I told my story. I think I spilled my guts on the table. And as I looked around the room, I was met with looks of people impatient to get home, looks of pity from others who felt sorry for me, and looks from those who felt I needed therapy. I felt humiliated and vowed never to tell my story again. Well, I did tell it again, many times over, and I learned a lot from that experience about knowing your audience in advance and not sharing more than you're comfortable sharing. So if you would care to, in the chat box, tell us about one of your worst or best experiences telling your story. And if it made a difference, if you felt like it made a difference. Hopefully it did. I want to tell you while some people are entering their stories that the PowerPoint for this presentation is can be downloaded in the small box under the chat box that says Files, and you will see the PowerPoint for this presentation. Also, it will be, the tape of this will be available in like a week or 2 weeks, and it will be sent out to everyone who has registered for this. So if somebody registered and is not able to be on the call, they'll be able to listen to it. And also, if you want to share it with other people on your staff, you're welcome to do that as well. Okay. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Millie Sweeney to tell us about using our stories. Millie?
Thanks, Jane. Family stories can be powerful in many different settings, such as presentations at conferences and different types of meetings, telling your story before legislators and policymakers, at trainings for professionals and other community stakeholders, or as part of public awareness events, and providing that one-to-one support to another family so that they don't feel so alone. We can use our stories as a way to turn pain that we've experienced into power that we can use to make a difference for other families and across systems. In preparing families to tell their story, it's important to help them think about where they are in their journey. Angry parents may not be the best storytellers, and parents in the throes of a major crisis may be feeling raw or too fragile to tell their story at that moment. Because it's not the best time for a family to tell their story does not mean that it will never be the right time. It's just important to help families identify when the time is right for them. And also be sure to explain to families who comprises their target audience. Presenting at a conference is very different from presenting before a legislative body. And the parts of the story that they may share is going to be based on who they're wanting to share it with. Also knowing ahead of time if there will be a small room of people or if it's going to be a larger room with 200 people or more can make a big difference in how comfortable a parent is in sharing the story and the pieces that they share. So make sure that families understand the purpose of telling their story. Is it to raise awareness or to increase funding in some way? It could be to educate policy changes. Or is it to share with another family to help them through what they're experiencing? The purpose is different in each case, and therefore how the story is told makes the difference. Helping families to develop their story to highlight that purpose and address a specific audience is the most effective way to support them. Our stories are not simple once-upon-a-time stories. They're fraught with crises, frustration, and even at times, unfortunately, tragedy. Families want to include every detail in their story because it is so meaningful to them. However, it's not really possible to tell the entire story. So if you can help families focus on key points and events that are relevant to the audience they want to reach and really emphasize the purpose and why they're sharing, it's very helpful. Have you ever seen eyes roll when a parent begins with, Johnny was born in 1999, and when I brought him home from the hospital, etc.? Johnny is now 18 years old, and the audience is already looking at their watches and thinking they're in for about 17 more years of this child's life. If you can help families omit the irrelevant details and really focus on main events, or those events that highlight the purpose of sharing, they'll be more effective and feel more empowered in sharing their story and be heard. At the same time, though, we want this to be personal, so the audience is moved by their story and can connect with them. That said, families need to consider what exactly they want to share and really what they don't want to share. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a bit. Positive stories and success stories carry a great deal of weight, too. Taking a moment to describe what has worked is very helpful, and conveys a sense of hope for our children if the right pieces are put in place. Highlighting a success story such as completion of a program, getting a driver's license, even taking the bus for the first time on their own. Those are our success stories. It's not getting into medical school, but to us, these successes are really equally as important and show part of the journey of supporting our children and their successes. Sharing them with the audience puts our children in a positive light and shows that they're more than just a diagnosis. And the audience is going to feel that, and it's going to really connect with that parent as well. Another thing to think about is thanking the professionals for their dedication to our children. It's important and it's appreciated. Professionals need to hear the impact that they can have in helping a child and family, as well as what families feel really worked about their approach or their treatment. That will encourage other professionals to consider families' needs and wants and them as a partner. Let's take a minute and hear about how your organization helps families in sharing to tell their stories. In the chat box, share ways in which you help prepare families in telling their stories. Do you have a training, or maybe you've developed tools that are helpful to families, such as outlines that help them tell their story? Take just a second and go ahead and type those in. And if you're willing to share any tools that you have, we can take down that information and circulate it to those on the call, as well as post it in Fredla's next newsletter. You can include links in the chat box, or just if you have something that you're willing to share, you can always send it to one of us at Fredla. Looking at the chat box now. Helping others heal, have a part. That's good. That's very true. So Sharon developed a parent leadership training. And Gloria, they have a training as well as a work group to help parents practice. That's excellent, and learn how to tell their story. It's very intimidating to get up in front of a group of people and share something so personal. It does help to practice. Training on telling your story. Thank you. Please continue to add those things into the chat box, and as I said, we'll be happy to share that and include that in newsletters that we send out. So we've learned some lessons in telling our stories. The family movement has really evolved over 35 years, and there are some things that we've learned that are pretty important. The biggest thing around storytelling is really, whose story is it? We've come to understand that there's really two stories that need to be told. They're very intertwined, but they're uniquely different. I'm going to turn this over now to Melissa to talk further about the two stories. Melissa?
Thanks, Millie. I want to spend a minute talking with you about the two stories. And when the family movement began, as both Jane and Millie have spoken about, parents and caregivers were the primary storytellers. It was a single story of how families struggled to get care for their children and youth. The families often told their horror stories, and those stories were often put on display to get attention or sympathy from legislators, systems, or policymakers. Those stories were meant to be heartbreaking. It was often kind of a shock and awe moment. It was all from the vantage point of the family, and the family or parent owned the story. But 30 years later, and with the growth of the youth movement, we've now learned much and realized that there are two equally compelling stories to be told: the family's journey and the youth's journey. The question becomes, as family members, whose story do we have the right to tell? So this information on this screen was adapted from the Institute for Patient and Family-Centered Care, which you can find online at www.ipfcc.org, which is listed on your screen there. And they have a wealth of resources and information that you can find on their website.
But as you're considering how to best help a family prepare to tell their story, here are some things to help them think about. The first being, what are they willing to share? And this is really critical because at different points along a family's journey, there will be different pieces and parts of their story and their experiences that they will be willing to share and others that they won't. And as Millie talked about, the audience that they're sharing with will also have bearing on what they're willing to share. The second piece is around what might be too private to share. So as Millie mentioned, if families are in the midst or in the throes of a crisis and their child may be hospitalized, for example, that may be something that feels very, very private, very, very personal, and they feel very deeply. And that may not be something that is the right time to share. What would your child or family not want you to share is critical to consider. You may, as a family member, be very comfortable talking about an experience, but your child or their sister or brother or the other parent may not be comfortable having that information shared. And so it's critical to consider, if I share this information, will this be comfortable not only for me, but also other members of my family? What will your story teach those who are listening to it? And Millie touched on this, but it's really critical that, it's one of the lessons that we've learned, as I mentioned, 30 years ago, a lot of time our stories were used as an ability to raise awareness about the struggles and the challenges and the crises that families went through. We now know that our stories can be very constructively used to educate, inform, and shape change. And so it's important to consider as you're crafting what you're going to share, what will your story teach? And are there negative experiences that are still bothering you and that might be too difficult to share constructively? So for example, if you're a family who maybe has had a child removed to the child welfare system, you may not be in a place to constructively speak about your story without anger or frustration or sadness coming through and interrupting that constructive ability to teach. So it's really critical to consider all of these pieces as you're helping prepare families and as a family as you're preparing to share your story. We've learned sometimes the hard way that telling our child's story has an impact on them regardless of their age. Young children could be haunted later by stories that were told publicly about them, or they could be made the butt of cruel jokes at school by one of their classmates' parents hearing the story and sharing it with their child. So before sharing stories about our children, we have to ask ourselves, will what I share as a parent respect my child's privacy and dignity? Are there things my child would not want me to share publicly? Are there things that might not put them in a positive light that they do not want people to be aware of? We often find ourselves as families telling kind of the worst things about our children because our systems are set up that we have to do that in order to access services. But as we share our stories, that information may not be the things we want to share as we use our stories to move from pain to power and to help create change. Have I discussed what I'm about to share and my story with my child? Have you talked with them to see if they're comfortable with what you're going to share? Do they support you in sharing that information? Have I asked my child if they want to share their story? And this is where we get into, we're now at a point in the family and the youth movements where youth have a voice and youth have a say in shaping how things happen. And so we need to consider what's our story versus what's their story, and have we asked if they want to be the ones to share their story? And lastly, is it possible that we could share our stories together? Sadly, we've heard stories where young adults have refused to speak with their parents who were vocal advocates for their children. And now as adults, they resent that their parents spoke publicly about their struggles. In other situations, presentations the family made at a conference were later used in a divorce case to address a young adult's mental health needs. So we have to really be thoughtful about considering all of the different ways that what we share can be and how they can be used, not just today and tomorrow, but for years to come. So what then is the family story? Your story is what you are or have gone through as the parent or caregiver. It's about what you've experienced searching for answers. We all know that it's often a very long process to understand what is happening in your home and what may be due to your child's mental health needs. It's your experiences finding help. We know that it can take a very long time finding the right services for our children and families. It's your experiences navigating complex systems that far too often require the skills of Sherlock Holmes to figure out the mysteries of accessing services and support. Along the way, we encounter many barriers to services. That's part of your story too. And it's often experiences of crises due to the lack of services and supports that our children and family desperately need. In the meantime, we do whatever we can to support our children, and that becomes part of what makes up the family story as well. This process and all of these experiences often take a huge toll on the family, sometimes financially because of lost employment or additional expenditures for services or medications that aren't covered, and all of this has a major impact on our family units. It may include experiences like arrests, hospitalizations, or suicide attempts. These things should only be shared if your child agrees, because the youth story is their experience throughout this process. It's what it was like for them to experience those hospitalizations, those arrests, or those suicide attempts. And it should be their decision whether to share, what to share, and how much to share of those experiences. These experiences may be quite painful, and we as caregivers or parents may not fully, completely understand their story for many years. Their experiences with the system, such as juvenile justice, education, or foster care. They may have been bullied that we may not know about. They may have experienced being locked up for things they felt they could not control. It's also critical to understand that throughout the journey of the family and the youth, there has been trauma on both sides. This trauma may make the parent or caregiver feel they want to share their experience, while it may make the youth not want to share, or vice versa. As we think about helping families to tell their story, we have to consider a trauma-informed lens to how we prepare them. We should never ask a family or youth to share their story unless they are ready and feel good about doing so. Families and youth who share their stories together can create extremely powerful messages. As families and youth prepare for joint presentations, be sure that the family and the youth are on the same page. By discussing what they and their youth want to accomplish by sharing their story together. Have them clearly outline what information they will and will not share and who will share that information. Speak with them about refraining from being judgmental. Parents and youth are entitled to tell their stories from their perspectives, and they need to accept the limitations that each the family and the youth may have. A parent may want to tell a piece of the story, but a youth may not be ready for that. And so it's important that both sides respect those limitations. Discuss how you can use mutually agreed upon language or examples in your story. How does your youth want to be referred to? Do they want to be referred to as a child, a youth, or a young adult? And practice your presentation together so you can feel more confident, at ease, and less nervous. And most importantly, after you jointly present your story, debrief about the presentation. Discuss what went well and what could have gone differently. Now I'm going to pass it back to Millie, who's going to talk to you a little bit about the considerations related to social media and how you might build a story bank for your organization.
Thanks, Melissa. Let's talk about social media. Huge issue these days because in the past few decades, we've seen the explosion of social media from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and YouTube and so many more. Everyone has a cell phone, and anyone can record or video anything, really, at any time. So we have to assume that anything said can end up on social media and never truly go away or be erased. As Melissa referred to, we've heard of stories where parents have shared about their child's substance use, juvenile justice involvement, hospitalizations, medications at conferences. And these stories do tend to resurface later when the youth is much older, and it can be an embarrassment for that young adult. It can even potentially damage their opportunities for a job or affect college applications or military involvement or really social relationships across the board. So some youth have gotten angry with their parents for portraying them as a youth who has quote-unquote issues. These are really valid concerns and should be taken into consideration and discussed as families are prepared to share their stories. They need to be aware of potential consequences of speaking out, but also how that can help others in doing so when it's done in a safe manner. We've talked quite a bit about how we may tell those heavy things when we share our stories, but it doesn't have to be completely heavy conversations. There are moments and incidents that have made us laugh in navigating systems and working with our children and working with other professionals. So don't forget the humor. Sharing a funny incident that occurred with your family can lighten the intensity of a difficult story. Do you have stories with humor that you use to get your point across? Is that a technique that you encourage families to use? If you're willing, share a humorous moment in the chat box that you've used when telling your story to a group. You can see some folks are starting to type. And if you wouldn't mind just saying, yes, I've used this technique before, or I've helped families in finding the humor to use in sharing their story. It would be interesting to know how many people do use this. Okay, definitely some people do use humor in telling my story. Okay, it does seem to be a technique that folks like to use. That's good. It's a very effective one. You can laugh or cry. I choose laughter. That's what Anna says. Have triplets, 2 of whom are on the spectrum, and twins. Wow. And honestly, as soon as I broach the convo with that people, they laugh. Thanks, Jessica. There is humor in our stories as well. It's also a coping technique, as Crystal says. Several of us who do a presentation on this, I think I'm familiar with that. I haven't seen it yet, Crystal, but I've heard about it. Okay, so there are some other techniques you can use. As a way to be effective in storytelling, you may want to consider building a story bank for your organization to have examples on hand. A story bank is a collection of stories from families that organizations can easily draw on for an interview with a news reporter, a speech about the work that you do, a fundraising letter, a meeting with a legislator, or really any other purpose. Often parents are interviewed for the story bank, so stories can be matched with the need for the story that you need to tell. How many of you have been called by a local newspaper for a family for a story? Reporters usually want something very specific, and they want it right now. And having a story bank can help you identify a family quickly that can help get a point across. There are several very good tools out there to help you build a story bank. Families USA has an excellent toolkit, and Network for Good has a much simpler worksheet. I'm sure there are more, and if you have resources and would be willing to share, please add those to the chat box. Andrew Goodman, who is a storyteller, had this to say: even if you have reams of evidence on your side, remember, numbers numb, jargon jars, and nobody ever marched on Washington because of a pie chart. If you want to connect with your audience, tell them a story. Jane?
So Fredla, in partnership with Vanguard and members of the Caring for Every Child's Mental Health Campaign Family Council, developed a tip sheet on the power of telling your story. That tip sheet also is going to be available in the download files. It was there a minute ago. What's up there now is the PowerPoint, and the tip sheet will be available. And much of what is covered today is also in that tip sheet as well. So you can use that as an additional resource for the trainings that you developed, or use it as a basis for the training that you do with families. So I do want to thank Vanguard and Barbara Huff and Shannon Crossbear and all the members of the Caring for Every Child Mental Health Campaign Family Council for their input into this tip sheet. So we have lots of other resources for you about telling your story. There's one from the Seattle Children's Hospital for the Federation of Children with Special Needs in Boston, and that's two. And the Story Bank Toolkit that Millie referenced from Families USA, and Don't Tell Me an Issue, Tell Me a Story, which is also a guide for building a story bank from the Network for Good. And other information about leveraging media, skills for youth and family peer support on telling their story, which is a very unique setting when you're doing individual peer support, different from testifying, of course, different from presenting at a conference, but still requires a lot of thought before sharing your story. And then another one about telling your own life story. And if anyone is familiar with StoryCorps, StoryCorps is something that's on radio where they actually have a van that goes around the country and encourages people to tell their stories. And it's often done on an intergenerational basis. And they have, over the years, developed some great questions to help people learn to tell their stories. So when you download this PowerPoint, the links to all these will be live, and you'll be able to access all of the tools and resources that are on here. And I do see that the tip sheet, The Power of Telling Your Story, is now also in the small file under the chat box. So with that, well, let me catch up here. We have had these beautiful storytellers with us to help us tell this story. And I will share one last story with you. This particular storyteller is mine. It was a gift from one of my children. It's how I even learned about storytellers. This storyteller has 5 children, as I do. And it's just about 2 inches high. It's so small and so detailed, and yet, to me, It's a treasure beyond any amount of money for what it means. And that's a story in itself. I think we can all identify with storytellers as they convey the connection of families caring for their children, which is what the family movement is all about. We thank you for sharing your part of the day with us, and we wish you nothing but happy endings to your story. We welcome any questions that anybody has before we conclude. I don't want to wrap up just yet. So if anyone has any questions, thoughts, comments, objections to anything that we've said, this is the moment. Please let us know. And recall that if you need to get off, please fill out the survey when we are finished. So any thoughts from anybody on the call? Any additions, corrections? Got a couple people typing. I do see that many of you have resources that you've developed. We would love to compile those and share those resources if you're willing to do so. Please, you can email them to us at FredLaw. So this is how to contact FredLaw, info@fredlaw.org. And we're always here to respond to your questions about storytelling or any other way in which we can provide technical assistance to you. And I wanted to just let you know about our next webinar, Learning Community, which is going to be on November 15th. So it's just around the corner. This one is of a very different nature. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid has just announced a new model of service delivery and payment for children. It's called the Integrated Care for Kids, or the INC model, capital I, small n, capital C, capital K. They have put out a request for proposals, or I should say they're about to do that, and family organizations really can and should be involved in that process. So we're doing a learning community so that people can get up to speed on what INC is all about, and that is going to be on November 15th at a different time, 1 to 2:30. That's the only time our presenter was available. And I think the Institute will be posting a link on how you can register for that webinar as well. All right, any other questions here? And I think that if we sign off now, that the survey will be coming up, and we'll wait for 1 second if you want to download the PowerPoint before we move on to the survey. And a reminder again that we will be sending out the link to recording of this webinar if you would like to use it for any other purposes with your own organization. We would welcome that. So we also want to thank our tech team, Tiara and Gary from the University of Maryland. They are the best in the nation, and we couldn't do these learning community calls without them. So thank you, everybody. It's been great sharing some time with you across the country. All right.